We're here in an African American museum to talk about African American history, so much of which is truly unknown today. For example, few know of James Armistead, a black patriot inspired during the American Revolution who helped make possible the 1781 Yorktown victory that established America as an independent nation. Or Peter Salem, a black patriot who was a hero of the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. He also fought as one of the legendary Minutemen and was a soldier at the battles of Saratoga and Stony Point. And in the famous picture, the 1776 crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, two men depicted at the front of the boat include Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, two black patriots who served with George Washington and the American generals during the Revolution. Few are aware that many of the soldiers who fought during the American Revolution were black. And unlike the later segregated regiments in the Civil War, many of the units in the American Revolution were fully integrated, with black patriots fighting and dying side by side with their white fellow comrades and soldiers. And equally unknown is much of what occurred in black political history. That history will surprise and perhaps even shock you. But as you will see, it's a history based on indisputable facts and documents. Too often today, only a handful of the heroes from black history are presented, much like showing only a snapshot or two out of several albums of photos. Too much is not seen, and often too much is wrongly assumed just from the little that is seen. One of the world's oldest history books, the Bible, offers a good lesson on this point. We all know the Bible story of David's victory over Goliath, yet the Bible also tells the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and of his failure with his son Absalom. If all we learned about David were his failures, that would not be the complete story. On the other hand, if all we learned about David were his victories, neither would that be the complete story. It takes all of these accounts to present the full, accurate story. So from the Bible, and from former writers in black history such as William Nell, Carter Woodson, Benjamin Quarles, Joseph Wilson, Booker T. Washington, Edward Johnson, and others, we learn that you must present the good, the bad, and the ugly to get the full story not only of history in general, but of African American political history in particular. Although the history of black Americans begins in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America, the political history of black Americans actually begins in the year 1787, the year in which the American political system was constructed. 1787 was the year the Constitution was written. Today, many critics assert that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and to prove this, they point to the 3/5 clause, claiming that the Constitution says that blacks are only 3/5 of a person. One of the earliest black Americans to investigate this claim was the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery and remained a slave until he escaped to New York. 3 years after his escape, he delivered an anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. He was promptly hired to work for the state's anti-slavery society, and he also served as a preacher at Zion Methodist Church. During Douglass's first years in freedom in the North, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected that belief. However, Douglass later began to research the issue for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but rather it was an anti-slavery document. He explained,
I was on the anti-slavery question fully committed to the doctrine touching the pro-slavery character of the Constitution. I advocated this with pen and tongue according to the best of my ability. However, upon a latter reconsideration of the whole subject, I became convinced that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but on the contrary, it is in its letter and spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence as the supreme law of the land. Now, here was a radical change in my opinions.
But if the Constitution is not pro-slavery, then what about the 3/5 clause? Had Douglas not read that clause? Yes, he had. Then how could he conclude what he did about the Constitution? It was very simple. He understood that the 3/5 clause dealt only with representation and not the worth of any person. You see, the Constitution had established that for every 30,000 inhabitants in a state, that state would receive one representative to Congress. The Southern states saw this as an opportunity to strengthen slavery. Slaves accounted for much of the Southern population. In fact, almost half the inhabitants of South Carolina were slaves. Therefore, slave owners could simply count their slaves as regular inhabitants, and by so doing could almost double the number of their pro-slavery representatives to Congress. Of course, the anti-slavery leaders from the North strenuously objected to this. After all, slave owners did not consider their slaves to be persons, but only property. These slave owners were therefore using their property, that is, their slaves, to increase the power of the slave states in Congress. The anti-slavery leaders fully wanted free blacks counted, but not slaves, if counting slaves would increase the power of slave owners. They understood that the fewer the pro-slavery representatives to Congress, the sooner slavery could be eradicated from the nation. Several founders, including James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry, even used the slaveholders' own arguments against them. These anti-slavery founders argued that if the South was going to count its property, that is, its slaves, in order to get more pro-slavery representation in Congress, then the North would count its property, that is, its houses, cows, and horses, to get more anti-slavery representation in Congress. Of course, the South objected just as strongly to this proposal as the North had objected to counting slaves. The final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, that is, 3/5 of slaves, would be counted to calculate the number of Southern representatives to Congress. In other words, it would take 50,000 slaves rather than just 30,000 before slaveholding states could get a representative in Congress, thus greatly reducing the number of representatives to Congress from states with extraordinarily large slave populations. This, then, is the 3/5 clause. It had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. In fact, free blacks in the North and the South often were extended the full rights of a citizen and regularly voted, both in the North and the South. The 3/5 clause had to do only with representation. It was an anti-slavery provision designed to limit the number of pro-slavery representatives in Congress. This is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many today who have never taken time to study the Constitution, could emphatically declare that the Constitution, all of the Constitution, was anti-slavery. In 1789, following the ratification of the Constitution, Congress expanded its fight to end slavery by passing the Northwest Ordinance. That law forbade slavery in any of the federal territories then held, and for this reason, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin all eventually came into the nation as free states. On the federal level, progress was being made toward ending slavery and achieving full civil rights for black Americans. Another important point in black political history occurred 3 years later. In 1792, according to the website of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Party was started by Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Party definitely played a role in black political history, a role that will be examined shortly. Some years later, in 1808, Congress continued its fight against slavery by abolishing the slave trade. A famous sermon commemorating the abolition of the slave trade was given by the Reverend Absalom Jones, the first black bishop of the Episcopal Church in America. His sermon was delivered in the famous St. Thomas's Church. Very few today know that in 1808 Congress abolished the slave trade, or that Bishop Absalom Jones delivered such a compelling sermon. Although slavery still had not been abolished in all the states, things definitely were moving in the right direction. Yet a major reversal was about to occur. By 1820, most of the Founding Fathers were dead, and Thomas Jefferson's party, the Democratic Party, had become the majority party in Congress. With this new party in charge, a change in congressional policy emerged. Recall that the 1789 law prohibited slavery in a federal territory. In 1820, the Democratic Congress passed the Missouri Compromise and reversed that earlier policy, permitting slavery in almost half of the federal territories. Several states were subsequently admitted as slave states, and for the first time since the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, slavery was being officially promoted by congressional policy. Several other pro-slavery laws were also passed by Democrats in Congress, including the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. That law required Northerners to return escaped slaves back into slavery or else pay huge fines. In many instances, the law became little more than an excuse for Southern slave hunters to kidnap free blacks in the North and carry them into slavery in the South. For if a black was simply accused of being a slave, regardless of whether he actually was or not, under the Fugitive Slave Law, he was denied the benefit both of a jury trial and the right of habeas corpus, despite the fact that those rights had been explicitly guaranteed by the Constitution. Because the Fugitive Slave Law allowed free blacks to be carried into slavery, this law was disastrous for blacks in the North. And as a consequence of the atrocious provisions of this Democratic law, some 20,000 blacks in the North completely left the United States and fled to Canada. In fact, the Underground Railroad reached the height of its activity during this period, helping thousands of slaves escape from slavery in the South all the way into Canada simply to escape the reach of the Democrats' Fugitive Slave Law. In 1854, the Democratic-controlled Congress passed another law strengthening slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, thus allowing slavery to be introduced into parts of the new territory where it previously had been forbidden, thereby increasing the national area in which slavery would be permitted. By the way, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Territory included not only Kansas and Nebraska, but also what is now part of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Therefore, by extending slavery into parts of the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, Democrats were pushing slavery westward across the nation, essentially from coast to coast. Following the passage of these pro-slavery laws in Congress, in May of 1854, a number of the anti-slavery Democrats in Congress formed a new political party to fight slavery and secure equal rights for black Americans. The name of that party? They called it the Republican Party. They called it that because they wanted to return to the principles of freedom and equality first set forth in the governing documents of the Republic before the pro-slavery members of Congress had perverted those original principles. One of the founders of that new party was U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, who had taken the seat of the great anti-slavery Senator Daniel Webster. Sumner had a record of promoting civil rights. In fact, he had championed the desegregation of public schools in Boston. Here is his argument before the state Supreme Court on that issue. In 1856, Sumner gave a two-day-long speech in the U.S. Senate against slavery. Following that speech, Democratic Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina came from the House, across the rotunda of the Capitol, and over to the Senate, where he literally clubbed down Sumner on the floor of the Senate, knocked him unconscious, and beat him almost to death. According to the sources of that day, many Democrats thought that Sumner's clubbing was deserved, and it even amused them. It was 3.5 years before Sumner recovered his health sufficiently to return to the Senate. And not surprisingly, the first speech he delivered on his return to the Senate was again against slavery. In 1856, the Republican Party entered its first presidential election. In that election, the Republican Party issued this, its first party platform. It was a short document. There were only 9 planks in the platform, but significantly, 6 of the 9 planks set forth bold declarations of equality and civil rights for African Americans based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Democratic platform of that year took an opposite position, strongly defending slavery. In fact, it warned,
"All efforts of the abolitionists are calculated to lead to the most alarming and dangerous consequences, and all such efforts have an inevitable tendency to diminish the happiness of the people."
Amazingly, according to Democrats in 1856, attempting to end slavery would ruin the happiness of the people. Despite such clear differences, the Republicans lost that election. The next year, 1857, a Democrat-controlled Supreme Court delivered this, the Dred Scott decision, declaring blacks were not persons or citizens, but instead were property and therefore had no rights. In fact, quoting from this infamous decision, Democrats on the court announced that blacks
had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln ran against Democrat U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Both parties again issued platforms. The Republican platform of 1860 blasted both the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision, and it announced its continued intent to end slavery and secure equal civil rights for black Americans. On the other hand, the Democrats in their 1860 platform praised both the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision. In fact, Democrats even handed out copies of the Dred Scott decision along with their platform to affirm their belief that it was proper to have slavery and to hold African Americans in bondage. It is worth noting that for over a century and a half, Democrats often have taken a position that some human life is disposable, as they did in the Dred Scott decision. In that instance, a black individual was not a life, it was property, and you could do with your property as you wished. Today, Democrats have largely taken that same position on unborn human life, that an unborn human is really just disposable property to do with as one wishes. African Americans were the victims of this disposable property ideology a century and a half ago and still are today. Consider, although only 12% of the current population is African American, almost 35% of all abortions are performed on African Americans. In fact, over the last decade, for every 100 African American live births, there were 53 abortions of African American babies. Democrats have encouraged this. In fact, congressional Democrats are almost rabidly pro-abortion, and they consistently vote against protections for innocent unborn human life. For over a century and a half, Democrats have wrongly argued that some human life is merely disposable personal property, and black Americans have suffered most under this philosophy. In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and imposed civil rights for black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. Who were the leaders of that new nation of slave-holding states? Democratic U.S. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi became the president of this new slaveholding nation, and Democratic Representative Alexander Stephens of Georgia became its vice president. However, returning to the election of 1860, with Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. In 1864, following the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, several civil rights laws and laws preparing to facilitate civil rights were passed. One of them was this bill establishing the Freedmen's Bureau. Another was this bill equalizing pay for soldiers in the military, whether white or black. The Fugitive Slave Law was also repealed that year over the almost unanimous opposition of the Northern Democrats still in Congress. While Republicans in the North were working to end slavery and secure civil rights, the new nation of Southern Democrats was determined to head in an opposite direction. In fact, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, the Democrat from Georgia, delivered a speech entitled "African Slavery, the Cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy." In that speech, Stephens first correctly acknowledged that the Founding Fathers, even those from the South, had never intended for slavery to remain in America.
The prevailing ideas entertained by Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the foundation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be temporary and pass away.
So what did Vice President Stevens and the new Confederate nation think about these anti-slavery ideas of the Founding Fathers?
The founders' ideas against slavery were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error, and the idea of a government built upon it. Our new government, the Confederate States of America, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior white race, is the natural and moral condition of the Negro. This, our new Confederate government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
There was indeed a clear difference between the philosophy of the Republicans and of Democrats on the issue of race and racial equality. Southern Democrats had been willing to form an entire nation on the foundation of white supremacy, and there was no doubt that the South was strongly Democratic. As a leading South Carolina Democrat testified during an 1871 congressional hearing,
for the purposes of this hearing, sir, could you provide a breakdown along party lines as exists in your state?
Almost 999 out of 1,000 of the decent people of South Carolina belong to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is composed entirely of the colored people.
when it came time for the presidential election of 1864, Southern Democrats were still fighting against the Union. Therefore, the presidential candidate for the Democrats that year was a Northern Democrat, Union General George B. McClellan. McClellan was actually running for president against his own commander-in-chief, but there was a clear difference between the two. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had twice replaced McClellan for failing to obey Lincoln's orders to launch aggressive attacks against the Confederacy. General McClellan's pro-Southern sympathetic behavior was in direct contrast with that of other Northern military leaders. And not surprisingly, the anti-black tone of this Northern Democrat shone through in his presidential campaign. For example, examine this 1864 campaign piece for General McClellan. According to McClellan, since white lives were being lost, and since Republicans were seeking both abolition and Negro equality, McClellan argues that he, as a Democrat, should be elected so that he could halt those policies. Republicans also took clear positions in that 1864 presidential campaign. The 1864 Republican platform therefore called for a constitutional amendment to completely abolish slavery, and work was begun in Congress almost immediately on that amendment. That same year, President Lincoln won re-election to a second term. It was in 1865 that the Civil War finally came to a close. The nation of slaveholding states had been defeated. President Lincoln and the black troops of the 29th Connecticut Regiment visited Richmond, the former capital of the Confederate States of America. An officer in that black regiment recorded the scene.
As the president passed along the street, the colored people waved their handkerchiefs, hats, and bonnets and expressed their gratitude by shouting repeatedly, "Thank God for his goodness. We have seen his salvation." The white soldiers caught the sound and swelled the numbers, cheering as they marched along. All could see the president. He was so tall. One woman shouted, "Thank you, dear Jesus, for this sight of the great conqueror." No wonder tears came to the president's eyes when he looked on the poor colored people who were once slaves and heard the blessing uttered from thankful hearts and thanksgiving to God and Jesus. thousands of colored men in Richmond would have laid down their lives for President Lincoln.
By the way, in these accounts and hundreds of others, the strong Christian faith of black Americans is apparent. That faith is as active today as it ever was, for a number of recent polls show that Christian beliefs are higher among African Americans than among any other group in the country. Returning to 1865, there were numerous celebrations by black Americans and others at the end of the Civil War, but even before the war had come to an end, a vote had been held in Congress on the constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, the 13th Amendment. Congress passed that amendment, and this poster was quickly issued to honor the 137 members of Congress who had voted to abolish slavery. At the time of that vote, there were 118 Republicans in Congress and 82 Northern Democrats. Of the 118 Republicans, all 118 voted to abolish slavery. However, of the 82 Democrats, only 19 voted to end slavery. Only 23% of Democrats, and these were the Northern Democrats. When the vote had been taken in Congress on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the chambers had been packed from wall to wall with expectant observers. When the numbers were counted, and it was announced that the amendment had passed, a roar erupted from the thousands in the chamber. Hats were thrown and voices were raised in exuberant cheers. Congress had voted to end slavery. How should something that profound be celebrated? Members of the House asked that a sermon be preached to commemorate the event. And whom did they ask to preach the sermon? The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Garnett became the first African American to speak in the halls of Congress, and he preached this sermon on Sunday, February the 12th, 1865, and it was powerful. He began that sermon with a recollection of his own personal experiences.
What is slavery? Too well do I know what it is. I was born among the cherished institutions of slavery. My earliest recollection of parents, friends, and the home of my childhood are clouded with its wrongs. The first sight that met my eyes was my Christian mother enslaved.
Garnett then reviewed the prominent historical leaders of both church and state who had strongly opposed slavery.
The other day, when the light of liberty streamed through this marble building, and the hearts of a noble band of patriotic statesmen leaped for joy, and this, our national capital, shook from foundation to dome with the shouts of a ransomed people. Then methinks the spirits of Washington, Jefferson, the Jays, the Adams, and Franklin, and Lafayette, and Giddings, and Lovejoy, and those of all the mighty and glorious dead remembered by history because they were faithful to truth, justice, and liberty, were hovering over this august assembly. Though unseen by mortal eyes, doubtless they joined the angelic choir and said, Amen! Hallelujah!
Reverend Garnett then concluded by calling on the states to ratify the amendment passed by Congress.
Let the verdict of death which has been brought in against slavery by this Congress be affirmed and executed by the people. Let the gigantic monster perish. Yes, perish now and perish forever. Let slavery die. Its death warrant is signed by God and man. And honorable senators and representatives, illustrious rulers of this great nation, your act so sublime could not escape divine notice. The deed has been recorded in the archives of heaven. Amen.
This was a momentous event. The first black American to speak in the Capitol, and he delivered a powerful sermon. Interestingly, in the front of this sermon is a revealing message. It is a message of thanks passed by the leadership of Reverend Garnett's 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. The church trustees were so pleased with the honor bestowed on their pastor that they passed a resolution declaring that it was the Republican members of the House who had asked Reverend Garnett to speak. The Democrats in the House did not join in inviting him to preach a sermon. Yet this is not surprising given the demonstrated attitude of Democrats toward blacks at that time, and it's not surprising judging by the Democratic opposition to traditional public religious expressions and activities that they still demonstrate even in the most recent years. For example, Even though nearly 80% of the nation supports voluntary spoken prayer in public schools, only 13% of Democrats voted for a recent constitutional amendment to permit it. And even though almost 80% of the nation supports public displays of the Ten Commandments, only 21% of Democrats voted for a congressional bill to allow those displays. Consider, too, the congressional bill to remove IRS control from over what pastors can say, a bill that would reinstate freedom of speech to American pulpits exactly the way it had been before Lyndon Baines Johnson amended the IRS code in 1954 to restrict speech in churches. Only 5% of Democrats voted to allow free speech for churches. There are many other votes in Congress demonstrating a general Democratic hostility toward laws protecting public religious expressions, just as a century and a half ago when they would not join in inviting the Reverend Garnett to deliver his sermon. Because of the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, black Americans, particularly in the South, could now enjoy their first real taste of civil rights, their first genuine opportunity for political participation. Within a year, blacks were registering to vote and were forming political parties across the South. For example, at a rally in Houston, Texas, on July the 4th, 1867, 150 blacks and 20 whites formed the Republican Party of Texas. And black Americans also started other Southern Republican parties as well. In fact, the first 42 blacks elected to the state legislature in Texas were all Republicans. And in Louisiana, the first 95 black representatives and the first 32 black senators were, again, all Republicans. Similarly, in Alabama, the first 103 blacks elected to the state legislature were all Republicans. In Mississippi, the first 112 black legislators were Republicans.
In South Carolina, the first 190. In Virginia, the first 46. In Florida, the first 30, and the same in North Carolina. And in Georgia, 41 blacks were elected to the state legislature, all as Republicans.
So great were the gains of blacks through the Republican Party that Democrats began to fight back in other ways. Recall that black Americans had made huge gains in Louisiana with the election of 127 black legislators and even a black lieutenant governor, PBS Pinchback, who later became state governor. To halt such progress, in 1866, Democrats, in conjunction with the city police and the Democratic mayor of New Orleans, attacked the Republican convention in that city, killing 40 blacks, 20 whites, and wounding 150 others. Democrats even rushed the floor of the Louisiana legislature to seize by force the power away from the elected black Republicans, but federal troops arrived to restore peace and return African Americans to their lawfully elected positions. Similarly violent and often deadly attacks by Democrats against Republicans also occurred in other states as well. While much early Democratic opposition occurred on a state-by-state or a local basis, in 1866, Democrats formed a group that became national. Its declared purpose was to break down the Republican government and to pave the way for Democrats to regain control in the elections. What was the name of that group? The Ku Klux Klan. Although it is relatively unreported today, the historical documents are unequivocal that the Klan was started by Democrats and that the Klan played a prominent role in the Democratic Party. This 13-volume set of congressional investigations from 1872 conclusively and irrefutably documents that fact. The Klan terrorized black Americans through murders and public floggings. Relief was granted only if they promised not to vote for Republican tickets, and violation of this oath was punishable by death. And since the Klan was targeted against Republicans in general, it did not limit its violence simply to black Republicans. In this old illustration, the Klan in North Carolina is about to hang a white Republican. This is a Klan push card from 1868, about the size of a baseball card. It is entitled Radical Members of the South Carolina Legislature. It shows 63 radicals. They were all Republicans. The Democrats called Republicans radicals because the Republican Party was biracial and allowed blacks to vote and participate in the political process, thus making them radical in the Democrats' eyes. Of the 63 radicals, or Republicans, in the South Carolina legislature, 50 were black and 13 were white. On the back of this card, all the names of the radical Republicans were listed. Evidently, if the Klan wanted to pay a night visit With the help of this card, they would know exactly who they were looking for. Although much progress had been made because of the 13th Amendment and the civil rights laws passed in Congress, Democrats in the South still found ways to ignore those laws. Congress responded with the 14th Amendment, a civil rights amendment to the Constitution declaring that former slaves were full citizens of the state in which they lived and were therefore entitled to all the rights and privileges of any other citizen in that state. When the 14th Amendment came to a vote, 94% of the Republicans in Congress voted for the passage of that civil rights amendment. However, the records of Congress reveal that not one single Democrat in either the House or the Senate voted for the 14th Amendment. Perhaps this lack of support for civil rights is not surprising considering the makeup of the National Democratic Party at that time. Here is a handbill highlighting some of the distinguished notables at the 1868 Democratic National Convention held in New York City on July the 4th of that year. Nearly 1/5 of the members of the Democratic National Convention were leaders who had either militarily fought for or politically led the slaveholding nation in the South. The handbill also featured portraits of two prominent rebel generals who participated in that convention. One was Wade Hampton. Before the war, Hampton had been a Democratic U.S. Senator, but he left the Senate when the Southern Democrats seceded to form their slaveholding nation. In 1876, Hampton ran for the Democratic governorship of South Carolina. One of his active allies in that election was a group called the Red Shirts, which essentially was the Klan dressed in red shirts rather than white hoods. To help win Hampton's governor's race, they issued the following guidelines.
Every Democrat must feel honor-bound to control the vote of at least one Negro by intimidation, purchase, keeping him away, or as each individual may determine how he may best accomplish it. We must attend every Republican meeting that we hear of, whether they meet at night or in the daytime. Democrats must go in as large numbers as they can get together and well armed.
Here's an illustration demonstrating how Democrats controlled votes in elections. Notice the caption. Of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. The Democrat Hampton was finally declared the winner and became governor, but only under very questionable circumstances. In fact, the editorial cartoons in Harper's following that election showed a triumphant Democrat standing over the bodies of slaughtered African American voters. The other featured portrait of the 1868 National Democratic delegates was that of rebel General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was a slave trader from Tennessee and was the rebel general that conducted the massacre of black soldiers in the infamous incident at Fort Pillow. After the war, General Nathan Bedford Forrest became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was an honored leader at the Democratic National Convention of 1868. Given the composition of the Democratic Party, it is no wonder that not one of the Democrats in Congress voted for the 14th Amendment to secure civil rights to black Americans at the state level. Even though huge steps in obtaining civil rights had been achieved through the 13th and the 14th Amendments, as well as through several federal civil rights laws, the staunch and steadfast resistance of the Southern Democratic states to those measures continued. They simply ignored the constitutional amendments and the federal laws. Congress therefore imposed requirements that before the former Confederate states could be readmitted, they must create new state constitutions that guaranteed equal civil rights for black Americans. However, the votes to ratify these new constitutions that granted civil rights to black Americans were met with massive resistance and widespread riots and attacks by Democrats throughout those states. For example, in 1868 in Mississippi, Democrats and the Klan attacked blacks on their way to vote for the new Constitution. As a result, the Congressional Committee on Reconstruction convened extensive hearings. For those who have heard so little of this part of American history, or of this part of African American political history, the hearings provided what perhaps today would be considered shocking information for citizens. Consider, for example, the testimony of election worker Robert Flournoy, given before the committee on December the 15th, 1868.
What means have you had within the last years of knowing the sentiment of the people of Mississippi concerning the Constitution that was framed at the convention?
I canvassed a large portion of the state in favor of the adoption and ratification of the Constitution. Of course, I made it my business to ascertain the sentiment of the people from what I could judge in general from the expressions of approval or disapproval of remarks made. And I took it upon myself to converse freely with the people. I have never met, in all my interaction with the Negroes of Mississippi, but one single Negro who professed to be a Democrat, and that was in the town of Oxford. He was a waiter in a hotel, and he informed me that he was a Democrat. I tried to convert him and failed and left him a Democrat.
This election official could only find one black American in the entire state of Mississippi that was a Democrat. Significantly, in Mississippi at that time, there were 444,000 blacks and only 383,000 whites. Since blacks voted overwhelmingly Republican, only by preventing blacks from voting could Democrats defeat the new state constitution with its civil rights provisions, hence the cause of the violence. Notwithstanding the strident opposition throughout the southern states, the new constitutions were eventually passed, and a number of black Americans were elected to national office under those new constitutions. This 1872 print by Currier and Ives shows the first 7 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. Significantly, all 7 were Republicans. On the left side of the picture is Hiram Rhodes Revels from Mississippi. An ordained minister, he served as a missionary and pastor, recruited 3 black regiments, and was a chaplain during the Civil War. Revels became America's first black U.S. Senator. Next is Benjamin Turner of Alabama. Turner was a slave during the Civil War, but within 5 years after the war, he had become a wealthy and prosperous businessman. Next is Robert DeLarge of South Carolina. Born as a slave, within 3 years of the end of the war, he was serving in the State House. He also chaired the Republican Party's platform committee and became a statewide elected official. Next is Josiah Walls of Florida. Walls was a slave during the Civil War and was forced to fight for the Confederate Army. After he was captured by Union troops, however, he promptly enlisted as a Union soldier and even became an officer. After his election to Congress, his credentials were challenged by Democrats and he was twice sent home. He was re-elected after the first challenge, but during the second challenge, Democrats regained control of Florida and he was prevented from returning. Next is Jefferson Long of Georgia. Born as a slave, he was self-educated and built a thriving business. However, when elected to Congress as a Republican, Democrats boycotted his business, causing him great financial losses. Long was the first black American to deliver a congressional speech in the U.S. House. Next is Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. Born a slave, he actually served briefly as Speaker of the U.S. House and was in Congress longer than any other black American from that era. The 7th is Robert Brown Elliott, also of South Carolina. He was well educated, reading in Spanish, French, and Latin. In Congress, he led in the passage of civil rights bills over the strident opposition of congressional Democrats, and he later became Speaker of the House in the state legislature. Revels took the seat once held by Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, who left the Senate in 1861 and became the president of the slave-holding Confederate States of America. The editorial cartoons of the day did not fail to note the irony that a black Republican senator had taken the same seat once held by racist Democrat Jefferson Davis. Notice all the Republicans gathered around Senator Revels. Who is that skulking in the foreground? Democrat Jefferson Davis, filled with rage and hatred as a black Republican takes his seat. While the Reverend Hiram Rhodes Revels was the first black American to serve in the U.S. Senate, there have been others as well. The second was Blanche Kelso Bruce, the first to serve a full term in the Senate. The third black senator was Edward Brooke. Significantly, the first 3 black U.S. senators, Revels, Bruce, and Brooke, were all Republicans. Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois was the 4th black American to serve in the U.S. Senate, but only the 1st Democrat. And Barack Obama, also from Illinois, was only the 2nd black Democratic U.S. Senator. The first African American elected to the U.S. House was Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. He was the first of 23 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress, all as Republicans. Remarkably, of those early black congressmen, 13 had been slaves. Consider the amazing transformation that this represents. In only 5 years, black Americans had gone from being slaves to becoming members of Congress. Not only had 13 of the early black congressmen been slaves, but many were home or self-educated. Additionally, 3 of that group were ministers, 7 were attorneys, 5 were school teachers, 4 were university presidents, and 13 were state legislators, a distinguished group with momentous achievements. Democrats did not elect their first black American to the U.S. House until 1935, and that black member was from Illinois, a northern state in which blacks had always been free. It was not until 1973 that the first black American Democrats were elected to Congress from the South, Barbara Jordan of Texas and Andrew Young of Georgia. And they were elected only after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the gerrymandered district lines that Southern Democratic state legislatures had drawn that kept blacks from being elected. While black Americans immediately following the Civil War had indeed begun a distinguished chapter in their history, the opposition to their rapid success grew just as rapidly as had their successes. Many Southern Democrats despised blacks and Republicans and utilized every means possible to keep them from voting, including not only the use of devious and cunning means, but also the direct use of violence. As a response to Democratic violence in the South, and in order to further secure the civil rights of black Americans, Congress passed the 15th Amendment explicitly guaranteeing voting rights for blacks. Like the 2 previous civil rights amendments, the 15th Amendment was passed also along partisan lines. Not a single one of the 56 Democrats in Congress at that time voted for the 15th Amendment. Not one Democrat, either from the North or the South, supported granting explicit voting rights to black Americans. By 1875, only a decade after the Civil War, Republicans had successfully passed almost 24 civil rights laws, and black American legislators often played significant roles in the debates surrounding the passage of such laws. One example involved a civil rights bill in 1871, a bill allowing the federal government to punish Klan violence. During the debates on that bill, Representative Robert Brown Elliott of South Carolina addressed the issue of Southern violence and delivered a compelling speech.
The purpose of the Democratic Party of the South, as evidenced in the utterances of its recognized writings and leaders, exhibits the declared purpose to defeat the ballot with the bullet and other coercive means. I have presented a few manifold proofs in support of the facts about the Klan. I have shown the declared purpose of the Ku Klux organization, and I refer to the official records of nearly every southern state during the past 10 months to show how that bloody purpose has been in part executed. This bill will tend in some degree to prevent its full achievement. I trust, sir, that this bill will pass quickly and be quickly enforced, lest the Democratic Party of the South triumph through armed violence.
Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey, another member from South Carolina, also delivered a powerful speech during the debates on that bill, explaining why blacks were most often the targets of Klan violence.
When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? We answer, because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving? If the Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there is no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God in the world in the day of retribution, which will surely come. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm, and as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope that this bill will pass.
That bill did pass, but only over the united opposition of Democrats. In fact, no Democrat, not a single one, either from the North or the South, supported the Civil Rights Bill to punish Klan violence. 4 years later, Black Americans again played a significant role in the debates on a Civil Rights Bill, this time the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 to prohibit segregation and racial discrimination. Following one Democratic tirade against the bill, Representative Robert Brown Elliott rose to respond. It was such a climactic moment that the artists of the day created illustrations depicting the verbal battle that occurred between this black Republican and Democrat Alexander Stephens, who had been the Vice President of the Confederacy and who was a leader of the Democratic arguments on the bill. Elliott's magnificent response did not convert Alexander Stephens or the other Democrats, but it was so eloquent that it silenced them. In fact, the Democrats' rebuttal against Elliott was so weak that the best they could do was to claim that the speech was not really his, that it was so brilliant that someone else must have written it, that surely a black American such as Elliott could not have created such a masterful speech. He so completely befuddled them with his oratorical skills that all they could do was claim that someone else must have written his speech. Representative John Roy Lynch of Mississippi, in closing his speech on the same bill, predicted what he believed would be the outcome of the vote.
In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I say to the Republican members of the House that the passage of this bill is expected by you. If any of our Democratic friends will vote for it, we will be agreeably surprised. But if Republicans should vote against it, we will be sorely disappointed. But I have no fears whatever in this respect. Republicans have stood by the colored people of this country when it was more unpopular to do so than it is to pass this bill. You have fulfilled every promise thus far, and I have no reason to believe that you will not fulfill this one.
That Civil Rights Bill did pass, but regrettably, Representative Lynch did not receive the surprise he'd hoped for. It was exactly as he had suspected. While Republicans overwhelmingly supported the bill, not a single one of the 114 Democrats in Congress voted for that Civil Rights Bill. That Civil Rights Bill, like the others, was passed by Republicans over strident and virtually unanimous opposition of Democrats. That 1875 Civil Rights Bill was the last of the almost 24 civil rights bills passed by Republicans. In fact, following the passage of that 1875 bill, it would be nearly 90 years before the next civil rights law was passed. Why did the rapid progress come to an abrupt halt after 1875? Because in 1876, Democrats gained control of the U.S. House for the first time since 1861. Therefore, with the divided Congress, Democrats successfully blocked any further progress in the civil rights arena. Facing such strident and irrational Democrat obstructionists, the enthusiasm for fighting in that arena soon waned and civil rights momentum was lost. However, not only did Democrats gain the U.S. House in 1876, but they were able to bring Reconstruction to a close by having all federal troops withdrawn from the South, thus removing the final protective barrier between black Americans and those Democrats aggressively seeking to violate their newfound civil rights. From that point forward, the South became known as the, quote, solid Democratic South. Southern state legislatures were again solidly in the hands of Democrats, and white supremacy in the South was reestablished, barring Southern blacks from federal elective offices for an additional 70 years. Returning to 1876, public debate began to focus on issues that had already been raised in earlier civil rights laws, laws and issues that Democrats were now trying to reverse, issues such as education. For example, this piece, entitled Politics and the School Question, Attitude of the Republican and Democratic Parties in 1876, examined the contrasting positions of the two parties on the issue of education. The Republicans had supported public education for all children, regardless of race,
But Democrats not only opposed public education for all children, but in fact strongly supported segregated education. For example, this is a published and widely distributed pro-segregation speech by Democratic Congressman James Harper of North Carolina. Notice its title, Separate Schools for Whites and Colored with Equal Advantages. Mixed schools? Never. Similarly, in 1875, the Democratic Executive Committee of Ohio issued this piece on public education to, as they said, expose the tricks of the Republican Executive Committee. What were the so-called dirty tricks of Republicans to which Democrats objected? And what was intended to be an insult about Republicans?
The only positive action of the Republican Party on the school question in Ohio is to destroy the system by requiring that whites and blacks be educated together.
The Democratic response against open education for black youth sometimes went beyond words to acts of violence, such as when they burned down 8 schools in Memphis in which black youth were being taught. Additionally, since churches in the South frequently provided education for youth, such as St. Philip's Church in Richmond, churches were also frequently burned down. And this is a flyer distributed by the Klan in North Carolina showing a school teacher being stripped and beaten. That flyer, distributed to teachers, warned, Miss Whoever, we send you a picture of the way we treated a Yankee schoolma'am in this county last year. Beware lest you share the same fate. Black leaders understood that good education was important not only to black Americans, but also to the future of the country. Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey, speaking on a bill to strengthen the education system for all students, including young black students, wisely reminded the opposing Democrats,
I shall remind the House of one thing more. The youth now springing up to manhood will be the future lawmakers and rulers of our country. That they should be intelligent and thoroughly educated is a prime necessity and of great importance, which is admitted by all and denied by none. All that may be done with this end in view will be returned with an increased interest. I truly hope that those Democrats who oppose this bill will reconsider their opposition and give it their vote when the question shall again be before the House. For one, I shall give it my hearty support, believing it to be just and beneficial in its provisions.
Unfortunately, 87% of the Democrats in Congress at that time voted against that education bill. Segregated, inferior, and dilapidated schools for blacks became the norm in the southern states under Democratic control. In 1954, the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education finally struck down state segregation laws in education, thus reinstating what Republicans had done nearly 75 years earlier in the 1875 Civil Rights Bill. What was the Southern Democratic response to the court decision finally ending segregated education? There was a twofold response, one of words and one of actions. In the category of words, 100 Democrats in Congress, 19 senators and 81 representatives, passed the Southern Manifesto denouncing the court's decision to end segregation. Those 100 Democrats declared in 1956 that desegregation was, quote, certain to destroy the system of public education and that there would be what they called an explosive and dangerous condition created by this decision. Also in the category of words, Democratic Governor Herman Talmadge of Georgia issued a written attack on the court decision and promised that, quote, there will never be mixed schools while I am governor. Mississippi Democratic Governor James Coleman, when asked in an interview on Meet the Press whether the public schools of Mississippi would ever be integrated, succinctly replied, I would say that a baby born in Mississippi today will never live long enough to see an integrated school. This was typical of what many Southern Democrats did in the category of words.